All right, let's try shift to our trending topic, which is John Mulaney and the Sack Lunch Bunch. This is a show that's been out a little bit. It came out before the first of the year, and it is a children's musical comedy. It is inspired by classic television series for kids like Sesame Street. And Mulaney is joined by 15 child actors and singers. They're all in the ages of 8 to 13. And it's a musical comedy special that's adorable. It's funny, but also it highlights psychological concepts that we want to talk about. But I'll start with this first, and I want to ask you all how you felt about the show. I love the show, but I am in a clear minority among the people I talked to who've seen it. My wife didn't like it, or she liked parts of it. She didn't like it a lot. Most of my coworkers, the word they used to describe it was weird, but I loved it. So I'm curious to get your take on it, Emma Kate.
I had moments where I liked it. Specifically, some of the songs were great. However, I would also lump it into the weird. And at one point, I actually turned it off when the song about "Do Flowers Exist at Night" came on.
I think that's the weakest song, by the way.
Yeah, like I was just like, and we're done. So I still listened to all of the songs. But go ahead.
I think that's the only clunker in the bunch, to be honest. I think everything else was working for me, but that didn't quite work for me.
I didn't like it. I'll be real.
Be real.
I got to tell you, I avoided it I did not want to watch this thing.
Why not?
It just seems stupid. Why am
You're
I
stupid?
I mean, if we weren't doing this show, I would not have watched it. But I felt it's really odd. I felt close to Dave watching it.
Yeah,
boy.
No.
This is going to
Would
get
you
weird.
like Emma, Kate, and I to
Buckle
leave
in,
the room?
everyone.
And
No.
you guys have your moment.
Yeah, I felt like ruggling Dave. No,
Ruggling?
Ruggling?
Yeah,
Juggling?
That
Ruggling.
sounds
Snuggling?
It's where you
Slightly
you
illegal.
stick blankets in on
Oh,
either
boy.
side of you. But I felt like I was transported back to HR Puffin stuff and kind of 70s Saturday morning. I mean, it was cool. It was just really, really cool, and I loved it. I loved the music. I loved the humor. I mean, I thought it was great. So that's my take, but I felt like I was connected to Dave's brain there for a little bit.
That was weird.
Yeah.
Just like the show.
As you ruggled him?
There's a game show, there's a sitcom, there's the music, there's the, it was, that show would have come on at about 11 a.m. on a Saturday morning.
But why were you connected to my brain from that?
Because we used to talk about like game shows and Saturday morning, like that from way
He
back.
thought about spooning you while you watched it after a
Yes,
sleepover.
that is it. And I'm gonna leave now. But thanks for having me on. Goodbye, everybody.
But then we can't ruggle one another.
Yeah.
Jonathan, before you two ruggled,
Yeah.
what was your take on it?
Well, I love John Mulaney.
I do.
But I also am familiar with a lot of his material that's outside of stand-up comedy. And a lot of his material outside of stand-up comedy is very quirky. Like he has Oh Hello, his Broadway special where he and Nick Kroll pretend to be old, Jewish and Catholic New Yorkers. He's done Big Mouth. He's done documentary now. And so he's just got a very eclectic sensibility. And knowing that, I wasn't expecting this to hit all the beats the same way that his stand-up work does. I will say I really liked it, but it's also the same age. The references are the same age that I grew up with. So John Mulaney's about 5 years younger than me. So we watched the same stuff growing up. I also watched mostly public access television shows growing up just because we didn't have cable. So I watched both American and Canadian public television, and these are the types of things that they would do. The only criticism I would give from my standpoint, my family agreed with this, was that we liked the songs, but a lot of them felt like they went on a little too long. Like they probably could have been a minute shorter because the premise was really funny and they loved the kid characters, but they started to be like, this song is going on a little too long, let's move on. That would probably be my only critique, even though I really liked most of the songs.
I bought the soundtrack, as I told you before, which is ridiculous, but the songs to me hold up better, even the more you kind of get
Listen to
into and you see sort of the trajectory of the song and what he's
The more Dave
trying
takes
to do.
his evening bath listening to the Sack Lunch Bunch soundtrack.
Yeah. So, kind of related to that, I want to go in reverse order and ask you first. Do you think this show succeeded as a children's special, as a parody of a children's special, as both? Like, on what level do you think it operates?
Well, I watched it with both my daughters who are ginormous John Mulaney fans, and they were pretty mixed by it. But I think it's because they don't get the reference points. The television shows that they watched growing up is vastly different than the ones that he's referencing here. They love John Mulaney. They thought it had a lot of heart, but it didn't really hold their interest for a whole hour, which I can't argue because very few, children's shows are an hour long nowadays. So they thought it was funny and they liked the sort of Broadway musicality behind it. But I think it's really mostly for people of our ilk and age, right? Emma Kate is the youngest one of us here. I'm not surprised of all the people that she maybe couldn't relate to it as much. I think John Mulaney is he is a database of pop culture references. So to me, it makes sense that, Dave, you as a Wikipedia of pop culture knowledge and me as a Wikipedia page of pop culture would find it most rewarding. But I do think it is very well crafted in terms of just putting together something that's quirky and weird, even though it's not going to be for everybody.
Yeah, I felt like it was very niched. It's a fairly narrow market. It felt as if he was doing something for himself, which is cool. It felt like art. It's fine. I enjoyed it a lot, but I can't imagine many people enjoying it, and especially not kids. I'm not seeing that.
Yeah, I was going to agree with the kids piece. I don't think anything other than maybe the buttered noodle song, because every kid could relate to that. They just want their noodles with butter, plain.
Yep.
They chose the Asian to sing that one, and
Uh-huh.
one
Of
of my
course.
daughters spent a good portion of her life where that was like one of the 3 menu items she was willing to
Yeah.
consume. So that was really like reading a child's diary for us.
And I feel like the pay attention song too was great, because that's something that a lot of kids probably can actually relate to, where they're like, hey, adults, look at me. I'm trying to get your attention here. And yet the kids aren't going to, from my perspective, that would just go over their head.
You don't think they could relate to Dad being a cross-dresser?
No,
and-
I mean, they might. And like when they
know.
stow away in the car and then they see him carrying a
and
suitcase.
just, be like, Dad, your 90s New York
Yeah.
sensibilities really
Yeah.
isn't cutting it with the
No.
Midwestern cross-dressers.
Although that was hilarious.
Yeah, I think it succeeded in form as a children's special, but not in content. I think it succeeded as a great parody of that kind of genre for adults. So I'm not quite sure that it would be a show that most kids or teens would love, but it certainly looks like it, and it certainly behaves like it. It just, the content is just, it's more adult. And I think ultimately at the end of the day, that's where it really succeeds. But one of the interesting things, the reason we want to talk about it was not only do we love John Mulaney, but there's a lot of psychological stuff happening in this show. And one of the big themes is anxiety and fear of death, childhood anxieties, those kinds of things. How do you think that this show did with giving kids a chance to talk about that, and then how it handled those kinds of concepts of anxiety and fear? Emma Kate, thoughts about that?
I loved how they did that, honestly, because it's just, kids are just going to speak their mind freely, and that is exactly what they conveyed. The clown and then the sweet girl talking about how her therapist made her dress up for exposure, and I thought that was funny. And then even the kid that was stressed out about grandma's boyfriend Paul, like there's real anxiety in there where he's like seeing his mom and his sister, the aunts, like giving crap to Paul when he's
Giving
like, I
crap
like
to
Paul. I like Paul. And so, just feeling that stress of something, conflict internally in the home. So, I thought it did a great job from that angle.
Yeah, the piece that I enjoyed about it, and I think it goes back to that familiarity of childhood, is there was this subtle little bit of Mr. Rogers thing happening where you've got this guy that's talking to kids like it's going to be okay, and it just sort of it felt like this safe place, and the kids were able to just express themselves and be heard, and I that was nostalgic for me, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, John Mulaney's been pretty open about his own anxiety, and I mean, you just watch him and you can see it. Like, this guy's got an element of tension just like oozing through him.
Right.
And I think in some ways he wanted to create a show where it didn't pander to kids, and kind of find out, like, did I just grow up with a lot of extra anxiety and fears that everyone else didn't? Because when he was growing up, when I was growing up, mental health and anxiety were not as out in the open to talk about as they are now. And what he's finding is, like, no, kids today, they still are crippled with fears and worries and anxiety. And to me, the one that was most relatable was when the kids would talk about either grades or how they would feed off of their parents' stress and anxiety. And that we see that in our clinical work, that there is this symbiotic or even parasitic, connection between parents and children. What's the chicken and the egg? Where is the source of the anxiety coming from?
It was good. Another theme that comes out pretty subtly, but it's important throughout the special, is children's relationships to parents and children's relationships to adults in their life, and how do kids understand the world of parents and understand the world of adults, and how do they enter into that. And so there's a big theme of the relationship between kid and adult, and what's a kid thing. And even that, if you think about on a meta level, that's really what, in some ways, what this special is like, what's the relationship of this special to kids and to adults, even as a thing. But there's a number of songs, there's a number of exchanges between adults and kids here. One of the songs, by the way, that I loved, is one of my top 3 in the show, is I Saw a White Lady Standing on the Street Just Sobbing. And it's African-American kid who's very talented, by the way, who they falsely say is, I think, Marlon Jackson's nephew or something like that. But that's just made up. But he's singing about seeing this white lady standing on the street, and he imagines his being a gentleman to her and comforting her and being, kind of the guy who gets her out of her depressed place. And it's all imagined in his head, but it kind of speaks to, like, how do we understand the world of adults and kids, and how do they interface with each other? And McKay, any thoughts about that in terms of the messages in the special about relationship between kids and adults?
This is not a serious answer, but the algebra song is so right. Like, you don't use algebra in real life. You don't.
Right.
Like, I remember always thinking that. I was like, never going to use this math. And I like that they talked about that.
And related to that song, the whole thing too about you're not going to use this, but it's also, it parallels the kind of message of the song, which is, I'm going to tell you how algebra will keep you from getting your eye poked out, basically. And he never does.
Nope.
Like, he never.
Nope.
And so it's kind of like the same thing about algebra, which is, you're going to use this, you're going to need it, and I'll tell you'll figure that out later, and you never do. Nope. It's like it's like the whole point of the song is, I'm going to tell you this thing, and I never am going to tell you this thing. So I love that. Frank, any thoughts about this?
I actually used that song in therapy because I have this sort of analogy that I tell kids. I took 5 years of French, and I can't speak French. And I have 5 doctoral classes on stats, and I don't think I can do it anymore.
And you were the senior researcher of the largest mental health provider in the country using stats.
Yeah, which sounds hilarious to hear that said out loud right now.
Or dangerous.
Yeah. But it's sort of like, then what is the point of algebra? And what is the point of school? And the analogy I use for kids is that school is a filter. And it filters out the lazies, and it filters out the dummies. And it's really a competition to get through these hurdles. Yeah, I do. I said it this morning to somebody. And it's like, okay, yeah, you're not going to use this stuff. And the point is you got to get through it. So there's that message.
I just want to comment that we all have strengths and weaknesses. That's all.
And we just know a lot of Franks.
I can say bonjour.
And we know a lot of Frank's strengths and weaknesses.
Well, yeah.
Strength.
Strength. Or weaknesses.
It's singular.
Strength and weaknesses.
Strength.
Yes.
That's funny.
All right. Bail us out of that one, Jonathan.
Well, we've already talked about Mr. Tudor, played by Andre DeShields, and I also want to talk about Jake Gyllenhaal as Mr. Music, because those two really hit the sweet spot with me in that this relationship between adults and kids, that adults in these two setups or skits, it's all about teaching and it's all about imparting or proving something to kids. Even though with Mr. Tudor, with algebra, like he's not explaining anything. Or with Mr. Music, he's failing epically and getting so frustrated. Like they're bypassing having an actual relationship, a connection with these kids. So you think about the skit with I saw the white woman crying in New York, and it's all about this kid trying to make a connection. But a lot of the adults in these skits are not. They're trying to teach kids, they're trying to mold them, and they're missing that relationship. And I think that there's something very profound about that with today's times, where kids are just wanting to feel connected, and we're seeing that they're struggling to do this, either with peers or with adults. And parents are so wrapped up in their own sort of like mindset of what they think kids need that they miss these bids, that these longings that children or even their own children just want them to be available, want them to notice them. And I think the film does a really subtle but great job highlighting the sort of ridiculousness of that.
I think that's an outstanding point. And I will say this about the Mr. Music song. First of all, I will go to my death saying that this needs an Emmy nomination for Jake Gyllenhaal.
You're going to go till tomorrow? What?
Right till tomorrow. I might make it 3 more days. No, this performance. Talk about somebody who's all in with the performance. It is so good, and every time you watch it, it's like it holds up so great. He nails this thing. But you're exactly right that there is this guy who's not prepared. He hadn't thought it through. And then he's trying to impart all this stuff to kids. And the kids actually try and help him out. Hey, would you like to use my clarinet? And he's like, he calls her ignorant. You're ignorant. He just gets all mad at her because she's trying to, you're missing the point of the song. We can make music from all these other things, which he can't. And then later he kind of breaks down and goes, give me that clarinet. And he throws it out the window to make a sound. And it lands in a truck with pillows or something in it and doesn't make it. Like he's failing at all. And they're trying to help him. And he's just so committed to being the guy who's going to like impart something to them and does it epically. And I think I think that's intentional in that song and in the Andre DeShields song. I think there's this sense of like, these are the adults in your life, except for the John Mulaney character, who are like trying to teach you things, and they're not doing a great job with it. So I think it's awesome. Last question, any other psychological ideas or themes or anything that you want to comment on about this special? Anybody can go. It's freestyle here.
Well, I think it's a great portrait of not condescending to children. And I feel like I just come across that so much in my clinical work, where parents don't believe enough in their kids, don't listen to their kids enough, don't let them fail or take risks. It's all about performance. It's all about imparting all this fear and stress and pressure. And I think we're seeing a nation that is crumbling under the way that we seem to be parenting young kids. Like, I don't like to blame the parents, but there's got to be a degree of responsibility in what we are communicating to kids.
I liked that there was this sort of altruistic component with the kids seeming to want to help others in need across several of the songs, particularly. And I feel like that is something that is really inherent in children and teens, where it's like, if we can tune into that piece more, the better. Like, this generation of teens is extremely active and political, and I think it's phenomenal that we are in some ways listening to their voice more than we have historically, but it's like we need to do more of that.
Yeah, I would echo what Jonathan said. And one of the interesting things about that show was sort of this reversal of the kids seem to be the smart ones. And
Which was not the case when you were growing up.
No, no, not in the least. But it's sort of, let's listen to the kids. They got something going on, and not so much the adults.
Frank, would you describe your childhood and your upbringing as a bunch of horses loose in a hospital?
I would say it was a horse loose in a hospital. Sometimes the horse does something, you're like, I didn't know it could do that.
Like have a second family.
I was going to say use an elevator, but sure. Thanks for that.
No idea what's happening. I apologize
I don't
for our listeners. We're sorry.
We just went off the rails right at the very end. But a good time to wrap it all up.
We made it to the end.
Yeah. And so you heard it. For some of you, this special is not going to be your cup of tea. But for those of you who like John Mulaney, who have a high tolerance for a little bit of quirky and a little bit of off the beaten path, it might be just right for you. I loved it. I would recommend it, but with that qualification. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Shrink Tank Podcast. I'm Dave Verhagen in Nashville. I'm signing off for Emma Kate Reif, Frank Gaskell, and Jonathan Hedderly in Charlotte. We want you to tell all your friends about us and make it a great week.